Oh, smoking.
Yeah.
Didn't remember that.
Mm. Okay,
Alrighty, so yeah, so we'll just pick up where we left off here. The next slide is a proposal to restructure our residential zone names is the most significant piece here. There is one or two zones that we would propose to merge into one, but in essence, it came up a couple of times at VPAC, in FBM report, and at public engagement that the estate residential zone, the name of it, probably could do with a change. It carries a little bit of baggage with it, and it might not be the kind of terminology that we want in our plan in 2022.
okay.
So that kind of prompted this. And then when I started to look at the other residential zone names, I wasn't sure if they were, depending on how the new plan comes into effect, if they were going to really truly representing what they reflected. The names were reflecting what they were. And so ultimately, I've thought that it might make more sense to go to what's actually a more standardized form of sort of an R1 through R4 zoning. That's typically what you'd find in many other land use bylaws. And it's just typically where your R1 would be similar to your single unit zone. And then as you move up to R2 or 3 or 4 or beyond, you would have more intensity or more density permitted in
What does the R stand for?
residential.
Oh,
Yeah, just, yeah. So rather than say, like under the current plan, we had the low density residential zone, the medium density residential zone, the central village residential zone, the estate residential zone. This would just move us to R1 to R4. So in essence, what we'll be looking at here is the estate zone and the single unit residential zone would be combined into the new R1 zone. So those being the most restrictive. The central village residential zone would become R2. The low density would become R3. And then we're proposing, which there is another slide here for, to add a new R4 zone along section of Highway 3.
Okay, Andre.
The current state residential zone has with it minimum lot area requirement.
Mhm.
Will that continue on with your new proposed zone?
I've got a slide on that one too, to reduce that lot area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please carry on.
Okay.
You'll like it. I like it.
And actually, that is related because part of merging it with the single unit would be to have a consistent lot size between the two.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I wasn't obviously around when this was created. I'm not sure what problem we were trying to overcome when we created this thing. It doesn't make any sense to me at all on any level.
Never made sense. Can't give you the story on live TV.
Anyway,
I was there.
keep going.
I was there.
Yeah. So
No sense.
on a related note, the next slide here would be like I mentioned, the creation of a new R4 zone. This was a pretty big part of the discussion at the Highway 3 workshop that we held in August this year at the Legion. Part of that workshop, we had created some what we called staff proposals for sort of proposed changes to the Highway 3 area. And so we discussed those. And that included, we were calling it the highway residential zone at the time, but it's the same as what we're now calling the R4 zone. In essence, it would be a residential zone. So the only commercial uses would be home-based businesses. So those are those smaller kind of office uses and small craft shops. And the direction which was well received at the Highway 3 workshop, would be to within this zone allow small multi-unit buildings, likely up to 8 dwelling units as of right.
Great.
That was a big.
Before you go on.
Oh, yeah, sure.
All right, so I encounter this in many jurisdictions where you have a certain number of dwelling units per PID, but I think that's an attempt to create some sort of density control. But PIDs themselves aren't uniform in size, so sometimes you have huge PIDs and then you're required only, say in this case, 8 dwelling units. And then maybe the next one is tiny, it also gets 8 units. And then we have this exercise of creating more lots just so they can artificially have more units, even though they may be the same owner and the same everything. And it'd be nice if somehow we could be thoughtful about a way to overcome that problem that happens. Because if really what you're trying to do is create a higher level of permitted density, it'd be nice if somehow it could be tied to area
Right. Sure.
or whatever,
Yep.
rather than lots.
Yeah,
That just as a
That's-
suggestion.
that makes sense.
Yeah, that's definitely possible to say each, dwelling unit would require X square
number of
meters of
square
lot
feet.
area, something like that. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, like you could have a tiny one and just build a tower,
Right,
or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to people? It does make sense. To tie it to lot size. Derek,
Garth, I think it was at the PAC when we discussed this, with the PAC we discussed it.
I think so, yes, yeah, it did come to that.
Yeah, and talked about not allowing commercial in the residential, but maybe allowing residential and commercial. We really hadn't come to grips with how we were going to handle allowing residential and commercial zone.
Right.
So we,
There is a slide that touches on that. I do have a couple of ideas, I guess, for potentially.
so we won't discuss it here, we'll wait till the.
Yeah, just a couple more slides,
Yeah.
sure, yeah.
okay, so do what you can.
So-
for the
Yeah, so we could look at some sort of a formula per
drawing.
per dwelling unit up to 8 or something like, we can still keep, and the reason, frankly, part of at the workshop, what we were looking for was feedback on that number of units. So I think that's actually a great suggestion. We were trying to say, is it 4 units? Is it 6 units? Is it 12 units? Like, what's the appropriate number? And 8 seemed to get a pretty good feedback. So I think tying that back to an area calculation of up to 8, assuming you have
X
an
number of
adequate
square feet.
amount of area.
My developer came to us and said, and we looked into this proposal, and he had an acre. We would just chop it up into 4 pieces.
Right, and
And then
maximize.
that's 32
Right.
units instead of 8.
Exactly. So we should really.
Well, what's the point of that?
Density,
That-
yeah.
It's
Yeah,
just
it should
spending a
be-
lot of money on surveying and
Yeah.
it's the.
Yeah, lot size should have a lot to do.
Sure, yeah, so absolutely, we'll revise that with a,
And have we decided to limit it to 8? Or we're gonna make it larger?
Depending on the size of the lot.
right, so if we move to a formula that potentially would allow
Allow more.
higher, yeah,
But maybe we have to make them, well, maybe from a visual characteristic, you don't want huge buildings, maybe you limit each structure to 8 or
right,
or something like that. There might be other ways to handle that, the architectural aspect of that, not having huge block buildings, which I don't think is in keeping with
Right.
what Chester wants.
absolutely.
No, that's good.
Okay, next slide. Great.
Okay, so the next one, as one Councilor Vino had mentioned, so this would be to reduce the minimum lot size in the estate zone, which is potentially going to be called the R1 zone. So we've heard that both at council and in the FBM report, that was noted as something that should be looked at. Currently, the minimum lot size is 40,000 square feet in that zone, which is much larger than the minimum lot size in all of our other village zones. So what we would look to do there is reduce that lot size to be basically more consistent with our other residential zones. But then I do have a note there that obviously in any areas that are unserviced by central sewer, that minimum lot size is going to be whatever Nova Scotia Department of Environment deems acceptable.
Trust that.
Yeah. Okay,
What do you recommend for the size?
sorry.
Similar to what we.
Yeah, so the other zones are in the range of, many of them, the central village zone is in the range of 8,000 square feet per lot. So a significant reduction if we went that far. We'll still be open to feedback if we didn't,
Yeah, that's huge.
yeah, and that would, 8,000 would require central sewer. If you didn't have that, you'd need much more in order to get out.
That's about a quarter of an acre.
And it isn't service, so it wouldn't.
Is that the size, like 8,000 square feet, is it about a
Yeah.
quarter of an acre?
Yeah, roughly,
Approximately 40,000 square.
or, yeah,
It's
it's a
an
little
acre.
larger, but yeah.
More than 40. 40 is less than an acre, but
Yeah. It's right.
Roughly.
Yeah.
42,000, 42,500 40 acres.
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
Okay,
All right, so the next one, Councillor Wells, to your point on residential uses in the commercial zone, this would probably be a good place for that discussion. So again, as part of the Highway 3 workshop, this map that's attached here, a little hard to see, but was one of the staff proposals that we brought to the public and got feedback on. So that basically the blue is institutional zoning. That's pretty much existing except for the Windjammer property, which we anticipate being the fire hall, so we would look to enable that through institutional. The yellow would be the new R4 zone, and then the red is highway commercial as it exists today, except it's been removed from other sections of Highway 3. So the thinking here was we would reduce the area of the highway commercial zone, but within the remaining highway commercial zone, look to loosen some of our existing site plan requirements that we have heard have, either prohibited or inhibited development or expansion of existing businesses. We've had several examples of businesses that worked quite hard to not go through site plan approval or change plans or abandon plans. And so that's part of what we heard from the business community, was that area is too tightly regulated with some of the detailed architectural controls and other things that are there. So what we would look to do there is take some of those regulations out of site plan approval and put them in through as of right. So we wouldn't lose all of those. It's not to say it would be a complete clean slate. Things like parking in the rear of the building and the side, landscaping requirements, all those kind of things would be dealt with just through the development permit stage, rather than making them go through the much more costly site plan approval process. And I would recognize that this area has been designated as our main highway commercial area, and therefore commercial uses are going to be prioritized within that remaining
Make it
area.
a little easier for them to accomplish their goals.
Yeah, and so again, this would be the area obviously where illuminated signs are permitted through the amendment that we enabled last year. We'd be looking to reduce barriers for expansion of existing businesses. To Councillor Wells' point, I had a bullet point in here to consider prohibiting new residential uses in that zone. And that's had mixed reception. So my thinking there, and that's not to say that it's the correct way of thinking, was because we're shrinking the area, that we really want to preserve it for commercial uses. But I think there's definitely a bit more conversation, there's some more nuanced options in there to allow residential uses that don't interfere with those commercial uses. Part of the thinking is if we've identified this as a highway commercial area, it's going to allow illuminated signage. We don't typically regulate business hours, that kind of thing. Is that the right place to be putting people who are going to be living there? And once people are living there, if they then complain about nuisance or the business community, is that unfair?
Why did you build a house in the commercial zone?
Right, so that had been my line of thinking, but again, that is a pretty specific line. There's also, a number of ways that we could look at that to say that, residential uses maybe are only, above commercial businesses or placed in the back. So there probably are ways that we could allow them. We could allow them through a different approval process, like a development agreement, which might in other cases work against our affordability piece. But if we said the primary concern here is making sure that residential uses fit in with the commercial environment, we could look at it.
There's all kinds of commercial properties being built that are commercial at the lower level, residential at the upper level. And that's pretty commonplace.
My concern is impacting on the people who already own these properties and have
Yeah.
intended use for it, and then all of a sudden say, no, you can't build a house there.
Well, yeah, sure, yeah, because you,
And I know at the PAC, Sid and Mary had some very strong views and points, not to prohibit.
yeah,
And I think you're going to get a very strong recommendation from the PAC that we don't. And and as you know, I've been all over a lot on this. I go back and forth, but I'm really having concern with prohibiting residentials and commercial. I think it's always been allowed.
yeah.
It's
Yeah,
a
and
major change.
not to defend my position, but just as clarification, that the proposal here would be only for the highway commercial zone. So the downtown commercial zone, we see as much more of a mixed use zone, like at the parking discussion.
Only in the highway.
But yeah,
So if you have a
Well,
commercial.
Andre has his hand
Oh,
up
I'm sorry.
there.
Yeah, no problem. My comment is that I actually like having some restrictions in this highway commercial zone. To me, it should be a demising line between the Chester Peninsula and maybe some future growth, which will happen, which may be mid-rise buildings and other types of structures that aren't typically what you'd expect to see in Chester. And I feel like that line of commercial development over time, if we continue to support that style of development, will become the definition that defines Chester versus sort of outside Chester. Still has the amenities of Chester, but it's a different character. And I feel like we need to create that sort of boundary, and it's already started naturally. And I feel like if we can reinforce that with more commercial, then that may give the future generation some or like architectural and cultural separation from the two areas.
Sharon?
Yeah, I'll just comment, because I know that area, they were trying to do a balance between residential and commercial. That at the time, the community wanted that look, or they felt that we didn't want totally commercial coming into the village. So, I mean, maybe they changed their mind, and I guess we'll see when we go to a public hearing, but I know that the people that own residential now, if we change this and they want to sell their property, that it could only be commercial, it couldn't be a residence again.
No,
It's been existing.
yeah, the building could continue to be a residence, but they wouldn't be able to, on a vacant lot, build a new house. That would be the difference. So they could sell the property, like, so that falls under that non-conforming clause. So the existing residents would be able to continue to exist. They could sell, and the new owner would be
Because we
able-
have one piece of property in that particular area that can only be a business, but the person wanted to sell it for a residence, but it wasn't allowed because the piece of property is commercial.
Okay, yeah,
Just-
I'm not sure,
Well,
yeah, with that particular, but yeah, okay.
Well, that's.
No, I'm not doubting you. I don't know the specific
The
examples.
details.
Currently, the zone does allow new single unit homes. So again, I'm just, without knowing the specifics, I can't say why it's not, but typically the zone does now allow for new single unit
Okay.
dwellings. Yeah.
Gary?
I can do it now.
Or no, yeah, Derek, yeah.
I see the merits of both, but, and we talked about at a public hearing. I think we need to talk to the people directly impacted by that prior to a public hearing. I'm not sure how we can engage them if we're gonna make that dramatic a change in advance. How many actually property owners will be in that red zone?
I don't have that number. We could easily get that number for you.
I wonder
What,
would it be practical to send them specific questionnaire for comments?
we could do that. And this is not to say that we shouldn't do it again. For the Highway 3 workshop, we did send a letter to everybody in that whole larger area to invite them to the session, but we didn't at that point have all of the details on the proposal. So we had one or two members of the business community at the session, and they were supportive of sort of that idea, but that definitely wouldn't reflect everyone. So we could, if council feels that that's an area, we could definitely do a targeted
Yeah, I think I've
sort of questionnaire.
and if I had the list itself, I'd like to maybe talk to some of those people. I mean, I can identify some of you may have a better.
Absolutely. No, we can pull the list together. No problem.
One other thing, that the blue here, I assume that's Shoreham.
Yes, Shoreham and then OHC further to the right.
Okay, so nothing will impact on Shoreham's plan to rebuild.
No, and probably a discussion with Shoreham, similar to the golf club and yacht club, would be a good thing for planning staff to do, just to make sure. But the intent certainly is not to interfere with their existing property at all.
Well, there's two property owners there, right? The apartment association and the Shoreham Villas. They're two
Right.
distinct property owners.
Right.
And there is some discussion, I understand, about rebuilding Shoreham
Yes.
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 in a different location.
Yes. That's.
I just want to make sure that's not impacted by anything we did.
We're not proposing any changes,
Yeah.
so I don't see how it could impact them.
No, they already know what they're like.
Right.
But
Yeah.
if they were about, I'm not party to this, I don't know, if they were to be interested in buying part of that red. that would prohibit them. from
Oh.
putting- I don't know that, but I think we need to talk with them and make sure we don't impact.
Yeah,
It's a
absolutely.
very, very important project. and We have to have.
Sam?
Yeah, guys, it just seems to me that by reducing the highway commercial area along North Street, we're we're reducing an area where you might naturally expect to see commercial growth in the future. So would there be any idea of having a policy in place that would allow for rezoning along North Street if,
Yeah,
you know, that would lead that way because, yeah, there's large sections, maybe residential now,
mhm.
but down the road, that may not be where they're going.
Yeah, we definitely could have a policy to, you know, facilitate, expansion of the zone. I know one of the concerns that had come up with was around the time when we were making those changes on illuminated signage and whether or not we should have an overlay so that illuminated signage was only allowed in part of the highway commercial zone and the impact. And so that was all kind of part of my thinking there. And also, as soon as you go outside of each end, you know, towards Pig Loop or towards the mall, the zoning opens up because you're on the municipal side, so the
I was
commercial.
just thinking like you look across from the Sadie's, you have the Independence,
Mhm.
you know, that's all residential now. but
Right.
it's Sort of in the core of
Yeah.
a commercial area.
I think
So
maybe,
you might want to leave it residential for now, but forward thinking,
Right.
say, that may
That
be.
could
an-
easily become commercial.
yeah, so there'd be a couple ways to do that. We could have a general policy, or we could even on our future land use map, consider identifying some of those properties for expansion, or say something that properties that abut the existing highway commercial zone may apply for rezoning to council, something like, so that we don't get an island.
Sure.
But if it organically expands from where it is.
Because I can just envision
Yeah.
somebody coming forward with a proposal that's attractive, but we don't have any zoning, any planning or any
Right.
policy.
Yeah, we gotta change
And we
everything.
gotta start from scratch.
Right,
Yeah, it's a good idea, I like that.
yeah, absolutely. We'll look at a policy for rezoning.
A water lot infill zone.
All right, so this is, I guess a little bit, there's a lot.
Yeah, we're done with that one.
Well,
So this is something that infill, and as we talked about, water lots are a tricky one. We really have very little authority
Anyway.
in that area. We do currently have policy that says that infill beyond the high water mark is supposed to be done through a development agreement. We have a couple violation files that I think will eventually be making their way to council where that's occurred and it hasn't been done through our proper approval process. And again, it comes into a tricky jurisdictional issue because there's been cases where Department of Natural Resources is supposed to issue permits and they'll sometimes go back and retroactively issue, but then it gets very complicated. And I think there's a question, a good question to ask ourselves is, do we want to regulate
Get
this
involved in
this
that.
use and get involved where there is other authority there? So one day I was chatting with Heather about this and I said, what if we just thought about all our water lots as eventually they might be infill because we don't have that authority? And if we looked at it that way and said, when any infill occurs, it's instantly slapped with this zone. And that zone is gonna not really allow you to do much of anything with it. Basically, you know, you could have seating area, you could have grass and lawn, but you wouldn't be able to build any structures on it. And so I think what it would do is both allow us to step back from trying to regulate infill on the day-to-day by saying you need a development agreement if you want to do infill. We'd say that's the province's jurisdiction. If you have a water lot, you deal with them. But any new land that you create, well, that's our authority because we're the land use authority. And so we're going to say, if you want to extend it, that's up to the province, but we're going to say no development on it. There's been a similar discussion in HRM. There was a big controversial one on the Northwest Arm, and they have a zone, sort of same idea that there can't be any development on infilled land. So,
Go and infill it if you want, you can't do nothing with it.
right. So we hope this would act as a disincentive, and if nothing else, it would clarify what's allowed when land is.
So I asked you a question. Yeah.
Sure.
If the, I don't know if this is it in the card, I'm sure it isn't. I'm just thinking of your example earlier, the road block. If somebody at some point wanted to infill there, shore up. Because it's, I understand it's it'll be a little shaky there. Presumably they wouldn't be able to rebuild on that infill land if we did that.
Right.
So you want an outright prohibition.
Well, now that's an existing structure, so that,
But the structure might come down in any storm any day, right?
well, yeah, that,
I suppose you can rebuild it at that point,
It's on the existing, yeah.
It's still
footprint.
but maybe if it was rebuilt, they would want to put some infill,
Mhm.
and we had a prohibition.
So that would go back to what currently we regulate infill. So we say, if you want to infill, just come in for a development agreement and we'll talk about it. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be a better way to go, rather than an outright prohibition?
well, the only problem is
I just ask, I don't know the answer.
yeah, the only problem is even if we give them permission, they can't do it until they get permission from the province.
Yeah, we don't want prohibition to happen on our level. I just, I don't know,
Yeah.
and maybe, I mean, outright prohibitions, I find a little,
Mhm.
You're talking about removing us from that.
Removing us from administering whether we allow infill, but if infill was done, we would say that the new land, any new land that's created through infill is
Can't-
automatically applied with this infill zone. And the infill zone would prevent,
But in the case of roadblock,
right,
they would still be able to maintain the existing structure.
right. But in Derek's example, if the rope loft came down and they wanted to infill and expand out further, this
Oh,
would,
not
this would
expand, but they
prevent.
could build the same footprint.
Right, they could build the
so
same.
not on the new infill, we had that prohibition on it.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah, it would, that, you're right, that would be an interesting, it would come down to as long as the existing structures clause was, or the non-conforming, like,
Why wouldn't it take if you infill, why wouldn't it take the same zoning as the abutting property?
well, what that does is promote infill. Because that incentivizes people to, particularly the types of means that we have in Chester Village, that promotes people
I
to,
knew you'd have an answer.
yeah.
He doesn't want to hire for it.
No.
No.
My opinion is that actually, I think your proposal is a good one. If we get into the business of regulating inflow, and if it is to happen, then it becomes this new zone, which is just inert land.
Yeah.
I think that's the way to deal with it, and, in these weird cases, then the roadblock comes down or whatever, then they're not gonna build it with the same technology they built it long ago.
May not be
without-
a good example, I'm just thinking that for prohibition bother me, you don't get any flexibility whatsoever.
There would always be, and it would be a significant step, but in the case of something unique like their own loft, if they came back and needed to infill, and that was the only way that they could truly rebuild, we could look at a plan amendment at that point to do something specific.
A rezoning,
A rezoning or an amendment to the plan and
Amendment,
basically say
just to
that
deal
in this
with
case,
that.
the infill can be built on, because it's in the best interest of the
so
community.
why wouldn't we build something like that into a plan now?
It would be complicated to do in
I don't want to
advance.
overcomplicate
Yeah.
this, we need to get this done.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
yeah.
you couldn't guess at what all the possible.
Right,
scenarios
that would
might
be the,
The only way to deal with it would be to allow something by development. agreement.
right.
Yeah,
That would be, that might be a compromise to say that any land that's infilled, no development can happen except through development agreement. And then we could have a list of what we wanted there.
That might be-
Yeah.
Or rather, we could do it by defining the footprint of the existing building.
Right. Yeah, and so you can
Well, that
rebuild.
might not be existing. Maybe there's a good reason for them to build on the infill, but we want to hear about it.
Development agreement, again, you're always talking about your own tools, that might be a good compromise.
well, it gives you the flexibility. We can always say yes and no.
I know prohibition is easy to administer. It's fine, but
I'd be open to be a development agreement. for sure.
Yeah, other than that, it's not permitted.
Right. And we could have a list of what's permitted by
Various
development agreement, so
circumstances.
that things like, commercial restaurants and yacht club and things like that are, whereas maybe we want to say that new houses aren't, so that you can't infill and then apply for a DA because you have enough money to go through the process of building. a
Existing
house.
But there might be a commercial purpose, like you need it for a boat yard or to put a travel lift in to remove boats or something. There could be a very good commercial reason why you need to do this.
Okay, so you can take a look at something.
Okay, yeah, great. That's excellent. Thank you.
Edge door width.
All right, this one, probably pretty quick. This came out of the FBM report as well. Both the garage door and the garage itself, and typically we're talking about attached garages here. So the pictures might look similar, but there is a little bit of a difference. So the one on top has a much wider, larger door. And B, it's the garage door is what's closest to the street. This isn't an extreme example. There's some on smaller lots that I've seen where it's almost like a tunnel. The garage is right there, and then way back there, you get the little house entrance. So it's a matter of character. The FBM report noted that attached garages aren't traditionally part of Chester character. They were not saying we should stop attached garages, but they did have a recommendation that we should look at considering a limit. The other thing I like about the second picture is with that smaller garage door, to me, that changes the appearance quite significantly. And there's more focus on the pedestrian entrance and less on the garage. So the thought here would be to look at a limit for probably as a percentage of the frontage of the building, to say garage doors would be limited to X percentage. We'll look at some other areas to try to find what an appropriate percentage might be. And we'll also make sure, obviously, that we're not prohibiting, most types of garage door. We want it to still be usable, but possibly it would prevent a double garage door, a 2-car attached garage, that kind of thing. So that was one that,
Well,
this was purely out of the FBM report. It was something that I hadn't picked up on, but when I started to think about it, I see the point. So.
well, yeah, you want the house to be the main focus.
I agree with this, actually. We don't want Glen Allen Drive and Bridgewater.
Right, you get that very suburban look pretty quickly. So,
I think we're a lot gravel down.
so footprint, lot coverage. So currently, the Central Village Residential Zone, which is the one on the core here, does have a lot coverage and it varies depending on the size of your lot. But again, this came from the FBM report that is both the landscaping and the lot coverage are a key part of that character when you're going down the street and seeing, not one house that takes up the whole lot and the next one is tiny. So we would look as probably part of the architectural controls or the zone requirements, look to have maximum lot coverage in probably several of our zones, and that might vary by zone depending on, we have pretty good building footprint data from our building permits, so we can do some analysis of, in this section of the village, what is the average lot coverage and that kind of thing. We can also potentially look at some provisions that say if your neighboring properties differ from you, then that can give a little bit of flexibility. The next one would be aggregated massing. So this one should be pretty quick and easy. This is actually something we do now. The FBM report said this is good and we should keep it. This is one of the examples it's used, but there's multiple where basically large buildings over 1,500 square feet have to be broken up so they give the appearance of being more than one structure or multiple elements. Sorry.
No, we're all good.
Next one, remove the existing limit on vertical siding. So currently our architectural controls prohibit vertical siding from dominating. And again, the FBM reported that actually there are a number of styles, board and batten and other styles of vertical siding that are within the character of the village. So we'll look to remove that restriction. I think Councillor Wells' house was a good example of what does actually fit in there. So that was a fun little moment.
And mine too.
Yes, that's right.
Telling people whether they got to blade horizontally or vertically.
What my architect told me to do.
Yeah, really.
You'll probably notice these last group here are all kind of around the architectural piece, kind of group them together. So the next one is something we don't currently do, but did come as a recommendation from the FBM report to limit the amount of glazing or windows. And that would be probably on a per wall basis is the way we'd be looking at that. I think they're right on the mark with this because this picture is not Chester, but we have a few new builds that resemble that style, and they have we have received complaints about them. People say,
Really?
how does this match? What they say is, how does, you have architectural
it match the
controls? How does this
character
meet
of
the architectural controls?
Oh.
They can't imagine that that's allowed, given that we have architectural controls.
Back in the day, they didn't even make glass that big.
Right, and so the intended direction here would be to start to look at what a appropriate percentage might be, maybe something in the range of 60%. Because we do have traditional builds in Chester that have a lot of windows, and we don't want, because of, passive solar and all those we don't want to impede people from building an environmentally friendly design. So we'll try to find that balance, and again, probably look at some other bylaws, and if needed, reach out to FBM in particular for struggling with what percentage would be a good one there.
Can you make a distinction between all one big sheet of glass as opposed to?
I think that's also
Divide it
possible.
out,
Yeah, that's right.
That's gonna look better than. huge.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right. So there's a bit of work on the fine details there, but that's kind of the direction that we're going, and the objective would be to prevent sort of that glass.
And I'd be thinking, I mean, if you're gonna build, you'd want all the windows on the southern side of the house, obviously.
Yeah.
So you might wanna look at that aspect of it as well.
Yeah, and there's also that was another suggestion that came up there. We could have that limit only on the side of the property that faces the street.
Yeah.
And then that, it depends on how your property's oriented, but that would allow you on the back or the
Sure, on the
side
side.
or rear
Yeah,
to
yeah.
have more if you chose.
Yeah, so lots of people have sliding doors going over into their backyard.
Right, and we don't want to prevent a picture window or sliding doors or anything like that. It's
You
just.
just don't want it all glass.
Yeah, exactly. So the next one has definitely been controversial over the years. It's been talked about a number of times.
Measure height.
How we measure height, yeah, so just as a quick recap, currently, basically, the way we measure on this diagram would be from the very top, the peak or ridge, to the very bottom, which is the low point. And that is, it's easy to understand, but it's also the most restrictive. And it also discourages people from building with the terrain, I'll say. So if you're on a slope, it encourages you to terrace and cut out, because we're measuring from the bottom. So if you build into the slope and have a partial floor or a partial basement, we're going to measure from the very bottom. So to get around that, before people come in for their permits, they terrace it and create a totally flat area, and then build their 33 feet up from that. And so FBM report, we've heard it at our VPAC committee from a few members as well, that basically the way we currently measure is actually, in some cases, preventing people from building what might be a traditional looking home in the village. So a couple of thoughts here. So we're going to give it another shot, again, because it was again recommended through that FBM report as the sort of the subject matter experts. So what I'm proposing here would be that we consider an increased height limit, so actually increased number for the Highway 3 area. Thinking there would be to facilitate these small multi-unit apartment buildings and also allow underground parking. It may not be financially feasible in a lot of cases, but currently, again, with the way we measure, you're going right down to the bottom entrance for your underground parking. And then it in most cases makes it impractical to build a building large enough to support underground parking because of that height limit of 2 or 2.5 stories. So we would propose different architectural areas that we would have a slightly increased height limit in the Highway 3 area. And then for the rest of the village, consider altering how we measure height to something more along the lines of what's shown here with that blue arrow. So we go from the midpoint between the ridge line and the peak, and then the midpoint on the bottom as well. And again, that would encourage you to build with the terrain, as is shown in the example here.
Disturbing it all.
Exactly. If your 0 is the midpoint rather than the low point, you get a few extra feet there, and similarly on the top. We've also, again, heard from Sid on VPAC from an architectural perspective that would actually allow people to build a 2-story building with a steeper pitched roof, which traditionally we think of as being a more Chester look. And our current, what we currently consider as a steeply pitched roof 4 and 12 is really not a very steeply pitched roof. And so there are cases where this would actually
Improves it.
Yeah, exactly. So
Andre.
I'll just say that I welcome this change, essential change to measuring height in buildings. I think it's long overdue. What I maybe like to propose or put forward is that we have more, and if we're doing it by zone, we would have this as an overlay where the topography supports it, because I think some of the concerns we've heard relate to view planes and things. So
Yeah.
obviously, if you're building a house at the top of the hill, if you have a tall house, it's not gonna be a problem. Or if you're down in the valley, it's not gonna be a problem. But if you're maybe on the side hill and you've got a number of dwellings behind you, if you build a tower.
It's blocking the view plane is always
So-
the biggest.
What I'd like to see is, like there's an overlay in our zoning. It's not, maybe it crosses some zones, but it allows some extra height where it won't impact people's view planes. And that would, I think, be a more thoughtful way of addressing the real problem, which I think was always that people were living in the shadows of those dwellings potentially that were in front of them.
Yeah, they didn't want again, the view of the
And
ocean.
also we should be thinking about, as part of it, some setback requirements and things proportional potentially. I don't want to make it too complicated. I know you do that, but potentially with height, if you're going to go above a certain, then you have to have certain maybe setbacks from boundary lines or whatever.
Absolutely, we can look to incorporate those ideas, definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
Question,
Oh, sorry, Terry.
you can still, the chimney on that?
Yes,
Oh.
chimneys and, antennas and other things are exempt. Another thing actually that I didn't mention here that we would probably look to exempt would be solar panels that are attached to a roof, or they usually would have an additional, so that if you had a house that currently maxed out the height limit, you could still
Put a solar panel
on.
that goes up 3 inches.
Yeah, some have been like in the range of an extra meter for solar panels or something like that, because sometimes you need a little space between
Some.
the roof and the panel
They're
itself.
not cupolas.
What about, yeah,
Right, stolen.
No, we're just talking about
Yeah.
that. Use and development agreement.
So I just wanted to ask,
Oh,
so
sorry,
Garrett, that's
Garrett.
okay. So what are you looking at roughly? You're considering an increased height limit?
For Highway 3,
Yeah,
probably in the range of a meter or two, not
Okay. Yeah,
significant, just a
okay.
little bit more to get
Yeah.
a full 3 stories plus an underground parking, I think would be kind of my thought.
Well, it's better than it is
well,
now.
that's, yeah,
Great to have some 3-story ones that are showing apartments, don't they? 3-story.
Maybe, and I don't know, those might predate the,
No?
no?
I don't-
Okay.
They don't have underground.
No, I know.
No,
As far as the 3-story.
They must just max out then, I guess, yeah.
Sorry.
it looks like a full 3-story to me.
Well, there are apartments on 3 levels with an elevator, so I'm not sure how you measure. Seems to be allowed there now, but you just say not underground parking.
Yeah,
So underground parking would impact on the height?
yeah, because we measure from so even if you had a basement walkout, we'd be measuring from the bottom of that basement walkout, even if the whole rest of your foundation was buried.
But now we're gonna measure from where the basement. parking-
The average, right. So with the underground parking, you'd be measuring from the lowest point all the way to the very peak of the roof. And so if you don't have underground parking, then we're measuring from the finished grade of the elevation, basically, like
Get into that more with you later.
Sure.
Development agreements.
Okay, yeah, so this was another one that council had kind of given us the go ahead on in general, that we'd like to see development agreements used where appropriate. So we're carrying that idea forward.
We just agreed to use them in one case.
Right, and we've gotten some good suggestions here today, and there'll be more as we go. So I just wanted to mention that is in the works. Thinking of things like possibly like larger apartment buildings in that R4 zone by development agreement. We have that existing amendment that we made, so 5 to 10 units in the central commercial zone currently go through development agreement. I had put down new hotels because I think, again, with the outcry that was generated here, it would probably be appropriate to have those kind of uses for parking and also for water and all the other
All that.
things that we heard there. Playing with the idea of large commercial uses, even in that commercial zone. Obviously, when we talk about big box stores, those are a far cry from anything that we have. So I'm trying to think of an appropriate limit where, something in the
Or at least
range
we'd
of
want to be involved.
10,000 square feet or something like that, where if it's something quite large was going to go in, we might want to have a little bit more involvement with it. So that's basically just a sort of a running list, which I will add a few items to here as well. Okay, so architectural control areas, and we were just about there.
Yeah.
Again, there was good support in the survey responses for valuing and maintaining architectural character in the village, so we definitely didn't hear that people want to do away with it entirely. FBM study is obviously going to be something we rely heavily on here, although a lot of the items that we've just talked about, height and vertical siding and all those things will factor in here. So I have a short list of some of the things that we're looking at: height limited measurement, vertical siding, possibly placing limits for larger structures to use particular materials. Like if you go over a certain, that was in the FBM report, if you go over a certain size, then maybe we restrict certain materials from being used. That's may still need some discussion. The limits on garage placement and width, and a variance policy to allow you to locate your structure in a way that helps maintain existing trees. So where the yard setback might normally be 12 feet, if you can say, well, if I move it 4 feet here, I can keep the, the old
Keep
maple
all
tree
these
that's there or
trees, if I
something
put
like
it
that.
where you tell me if those trees
Yeah.
are cutting all that.
We'll have a particular policy in there to support those kind of things. So those are some of the items we're looking at. And from an admittedly early point in terms of the architectural design, I have a feeling that will be, I really don't think, and we've talked about this all along, we're not going to have pages and pages and pages of fine drawings and particular details. It'll be something like that, a list of sort of like
Do this.
5 to 10 things that were, we're doing this, we're not doing this, and then some slight differences in different areas of the village as well, where I see that ending up right now. So,
Yeah.
Okay, just a couple more here. So tree protection, again, noted in the FBM report and also in public engagement as being an important part of the character of Chester Village. The land use bylaw really isn't the best tool to protect trees because it only gives us that ability in relation to a development. So if somebody cuts the trees down before they come in for permits, there's nothing we can do about it. And so, like I said, we'll have this variance provision to help protect existing trees. The landscaping requirements will encourage landscaping, but that's not specifically tree planting. That could be shrubs or bushes or whatever else. So a potential recommended future project would involve something to look specifically at trees and vegetation in the village. And if there was a desire, something like a tree protection bylaw would really be the way if we want to really actively look at something like that. That would probably involve, getting somebody in who can do an inventory of our trees, identify which ones are important, identify ones, and probably in the public realm will be where we start. So like the highway right of ways and those kind of things, but it also could affect private property. But anyway, there's lots of considerations in there. So that's why I said that's really should be a standalone going forward. Yeah. And then similarly, expanded heritage registration. So this was again noted in the FBM report. And it's been something that we've talked about a little bit at council as well. So FBM identified, I believe it was over 100 properties that were over 100 years old that aren't currently registered in the village. Again, really, this would be probably a future project if there was a desire to do it. And sort of a rough idea for something we could look at. We've always had optional registration. We've never mandated registration. And unless there was a shift, I don't think that's going to change. So presuming that was how we'd like to continue, we thought what we could do is do some sort of an inventory, identify all the properties that we felt may have value that aren't. Send a letter to them, invite them to register or learn more about the program. If they chose to, great, we'll expand our registration that way. If they didn't, we could even look at a sort of an informal registry where you're not registered and you're not obligated to go through heritage advisory committee. But we identify you, and maybe even when we issue permits, it comes with a little brochure to say, you're in a property that's been identified as having heritage value. You're not under any obligations, but here's some resources like the Heritage Society and other places that you can go if you want to try to stay in keeping with the heritage. So it would be a soft step to encourage maintaining existing heritage. So that's again future project for another year. So that's it. I know that was a lot. Thank you all. This was really helpful for me. And we will.
We already gave you a bunch of next
more conversations, but yeah. So we did. We got that direction. So that's what we'll do. We'll go ahead with option 2. And work on a first draft here to come back to council. And I I'm always reluctant to do it, but the last bullet there, I said, subject to unexpected delays, we hope to have a first draft in the spring, public engagement in the summer, and if all goes well, we could be looking at hopefully an adoption, in fall of 2023. This would be my hope.
I'm hanging my hat on that. I think that's a wonderful timeline,
You gotta get it done.
and we have to get it done, and this has been a really good start. And a few tweaks here and there, I think we're very close, you gotta find the words now.
That's right. Yeah, put it all
Put it
together.
all together.
Yeah,
Yeah, so good work, and thank you.
Lot of work to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And credit to council and the committee and the public and FBI. I mean, it's been definitely a team effort. This is not the kind of thing you do.
I love that last slide, that last line, I really like it, really like it, I'll remind you of that.
And we may remind council.
Yeah, when you tell them to change it all again. Yeah, do you remember that line that
That's
you
right.
liked?
Well, we just had an informal chat with Modal yesterday. They're obviously going through a big plan review process too. And they had said they just got their work plan approved and their plan review will span through the next election. So I know we have different marching orders here.
No, yeah, we don't want nothing to do with it, we want it over with.
Well, it's one way or the other. You either have to go across and spread it out, or you have to get it done. And definitely, our plan is to get it done. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much, guys.
Okay, great. Thank you all.
Okay, we're thinking about canceling the January 5th committee meeting.
So, yeah, Pam has done a draft calendar. Pam, do you want to walk through it?
The first meeting of the month of January, the committee of the whole on the fifth, but no one's here, we want to get a package together, so we'd like to cancel that. Sure. So the
Anybody
12th would be council. The 19th would normally be committee of the whole, but because there's an FCM meeting on the 26th, we're suggesting canceling committee of the whole, moving the council meeting to the 19th.
Yeah.
So council can attend the 26th FCM. Makes sense to me.
So that's an in-person meeting, the
Yeah.
26th. That's to review the whole process of how we do business.
Yeah.
So does anybody got a problem with this?
No problem, just a clarification on the 26th.
That would be the FCM meeting, or NSFM meeting, sorry, in Halifax.
And what's that?
We got an email recently
Did we get an email on that?
from the group directly, and it's around organization.
Yeah.
Organizational structure and all
Changes
that.
to the NSFM bylaws.
Is that for staff or council?
No, it's for every council
Voting members.
encouraged to attend. It's the same as the NSFM conference, except it's
So there'd be no-
decision-making related to their bylaws.
So there'd be no caveat.
No,
So it would be no council meeting, it's
No.
the NSFM meeting.
Oh, we have delegates going, is that the way it works?
we send, everybody's able to go.
How many voting delegates do we have?
Currently, I believe, everybody can vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have a position? We'll talk about it.
No, Well,
Yeah, that's a good plan to actually brief you on that. We'll pick one of those two council meetings in June
give a
to
brief update.
review with you the proposed changes.
Yeah.
And you can consider them and kind of establish a position if you wish.
It's a good idea.
Yeah, we talked about it in the past.
That's a good idea, yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna go with that.
All good.
Okay, so that's it. So we're going in camera.